good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. Uh, I'm going to give it another minute or so before starting. I will be the host and presenter in today's session. I'm not sure how many people we have. Oh, someone from Australia. Oh my God. So I don't know what time of the day is there, but uh, welcome. Mhm. Oh my God, it's wonderful. Oh, that would be nice if those of you who can drop on the chat where you are dialing from. That would be great, just so you know who's here. Ah, Washington, Vegas, Dominican Republic, awesome. Santa Barbara, California, Canada, Texas, South Africa, amazing. Wow. I'm always blown away by what technology allows us, right? To connect people in such distant parts of the world. Yeah. Ireland. Oh my God. Michigan. Oh, this is awesome. Yeah. How exciting. Yes. Yes. Great. It's almost like uh, so many people in different parts of the world are represented. I am excited about that. So then let's go ahead and get started. It is very much part of this tradition of sensorimotor psychotherapy trainings to start all of our sessions with a short mindfulness practice. So I invite you to become comfortable wherever you are in. This will just be a short mindfulness practice just to get us all kind of in the framework to be here and listening and learning. And so for this, you can keep your camera on or off if you have it on. I just invite you once again to find the most comfortable position that you can. Yeah. And I invite you to bring your awareness within. You can close your eyes or keep them open for this. And if you decide to keep your eyes open, find a place where they can rest. And as you bring your awareness within, I invite you to take a couple of deep letting go breaths. Feeling into this precious present moment. And I invite you to sense into your body right now. Sometimes a quick scan of your body is helpful. How is your body doing right now? What are you sensing inside of you? And if you can, just put aside judgments and just allow that awareness to be here. The awareness of what in sensory motor we call the fullness of the present moment experience. You may tune in to sensations in your body, from a little itching or twitching, or perhaps an impulse to move or to scratch. Just noticing those subtleties. Our bodies are always in motion, in what in sensory motor we call micro and macro movements. And bring attention to five sense perception also. The sense of temperature and the space that you're in. The sound of my voice, whatever other sound is around you. Whatever smell may be in your surrounding. There might even be a taste in your mouth from something that you recently ate or something that you're drinking or drank recently. Just taking notice of what's here now. And also what you can get through your eyes, and if your eyes are closed, sense into the darkness right behind your eyelid. And perhaps sensing also into how your clothes feel on your body, how your feet touch the ground, or if you're wearing shoes, the sensation of the shoe wrapping your foot. And you may also tune in to the places that your body makes contact with the surface that you're sitting on. And notice how you're doing now. To spend just a few minutes with mindfulness of the body. And see what stays with you. Maybe something in particular, or some shift that is noticeable to you. Then I invite you once again to take a few deep letting go breaths. Once more. And very gently returning back to the here and now. And when you're ready, opening your eyes. Thank you. So, I want to welcome all of you to this introductory session of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy. Before I pull up the PowerPoint presentation that we have for you, I just want to say a few words about who I am. I am one of the faculty members at the Institute, and I've been teaching Sensorimotor now for about 7 years. This was pre-pandemic where I started teaching with the Institute, and prior to that, I spent about 5 years in art training and becoming certified in the method. I am a clinical social worker here in the United States, and I have a private practice, and I also founded and I'm the clinical director of a group psychotherapy practice also. And that's where I spend most of my time. I've been in other areas of social work, and teaching has always been a part of the repertoire of things that I do and that I deeply enjoy. And so when Sensorimotor asked me to be part of their faculty, I was very delighted because it is a method that I love and that I practice on a day-to-day basis. I literally just finished a session in Sensorimotor right before jumping into this. And a few highlights about myself. I am originally from a tiny island in the Caribbean called Puerto Rico. If you're familiar with the Caribbean, that's where I was born and where I was raised. And I also like to honor the original stewards of that land, the Latino, the Taino people that were there before the colonizers came, and you probably know the story. I moved to this country when I was in my 20s to go to college, and one thing led to the other, and I'm still here. I live in what is now called New York, right up above New York City, and the original stewards of this land were the Lenape people. And I am deeply appreciative of the work that I do. I am very, very honored to do this clinical work and to be able to support people. Oh, someone wrote Boricua, which is the original name of the people from Puerto Rico. That must be someone that knows Puerto Rican people. So, and then on a personal note, what else can I say? I am gay and I do a lot of work with the LGBTQAI plus community. It is a delight to be able to bring this trauma work to that community. I'm also an interfaith minister, and spirituality is very dear to me, something that I practice. I'm a long time meditator in the Vipassana insight meditation tradition. And believe it or not, sensorimotor psychotherapy, and I believe that trauma therapy in general is a very spiritual practice, which is another reason why I gravitated to this practice. I am in a monogamous long-term relationship of 25 years. We recently celebrated 25 years, and we have an adopted son who is now 14 years old and is a handful, people. If you know teenagers, so he's a handful. So those are just a few highlights so you know who's kind of steering the boat with you today. So let me turn to the formal presentation, and the way that our time together is going to be structured. This presentation is scheduled for 2 hours. So I'm going to try to do the formal part in about an hour and a half or so. There's some materials, an introduction to sensorimotor psychotherapy, and some of the underpinnings of this method. And then we'll spend the last 30 minutes with any questions that you may have. I'll try to do justice to those. Yeah, about our trainings, but also about the material that I presented. Fair enough? Okay, so let me share my screen here with the presentation and we'll get started. Okay, so then let me do this right here. Okay, so then, hold on one second. So, sensorimotor, I think I got it right. An introduction to sensorimotor psychotherapy. Trauma and the body is the name of our talk today. So this is Pat Ogden. I talked to her recently, and she's doing very well, though Pat doesn't teach as much anymore. She does more kind of bigger presentations and conferences and summits, but she's not directly teaching the method. She inspires us all and mentors her faculty into carrying on her vision and the method. So a few highlights about sensorimotor psychotherapy was developed in the 80s, and it draws from attachment, from neuroscience, from dissociation, and it blends cognitive, emotional approaches, verbal dialogue, physical interventions that are geared specifically to addressing implicit memory and the neurobiological effects of trauma. And this is an important piece that we're going to come back to it. That much has been written now and research about the importance of implicit memories in psychotherapy in general, but most certainly in the treatment of trauma. Sensorimotor psychotherapy uses bodily experiences as a primary point of entry. Other methodologies use more, let's say, like I was trained in system psychotherapy, so one of the entry points in systems therapy is looking at the systems that the person is involved in, right? Whether it's more external systems or more internal systems or immediate family, right? Behavioral approaches obviously use behavior as the entry point, and more psychodynamic talk therapy methods use cognition, just to give you a little bit of that distinction. So what was novel about somatic approaches is placing that preponderance in the importance of the body as a primary entry point for addressing whatever the client is bringing up. And I'm going to go down here. This is our advisory board. It's full of kind of, some of the biggest contributors that have really done seminal work in that in the field, and you may be familiar and perhaps have even studied with some of these people. These are people that Pat and other staff members have cultivated relationships with, and that contribute significantly to the evolution of the methodology as well. So what is trauma? And we start here in this question because I don't know about you, but I hear trauma everywhere. It's like the other day I heard my son talk to a friend and said, "You're bipolar." Like some of these terminologies or have kind of made it into everyday colloquial language and have lost some of the preciseness of what they actually mean, right? Or, like you're depressed or you're a narcissist, those kinds of things, right? So now we hear, I'm traumatized, or that traumatized me, right? But in sensorimotor, we use a very specific understanding of what trauma is. And here's the definition. Psychological trauma is a unique individual experience of an event or series of events or a set of enduring conditions in which, and this is the operating piece, the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed. Yeah? And I'll read that again, that the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed. Yeah? So the person's inability to stay present, to understand what is happening, to integrate feelings, to make sense of it all. And there should be something else here. I realize the slide needs to be edited. It's not fully there, right? So then what inevitably happens is that pieces of the trauma remain unintegrated, right? And so what we seek to do in trauma therapy is integration, is to bring those pieces together. And the rest of this presentation is a little bit of how we do that. Yeah, the situation is assessed as threatening, right? Like something happens to the individual, whether it is a single event, a series of events, or something more pervasive, right? And so this situation is addressed as threatening to one's safety, to survival. And invariably that stimulates that things that we call subcortical defensive responses. And what are they? Hyperarousal and hypoarousal. And probably that's language that is already familiar to you. The assessment of that particular threat doesn't just happen through a cognitive evaluation, but it also happens to the physical and the physiological sensations and impulses that happen at that moment. And these sensations and impulses precede cognition and emotion. In other words, they happen kind of on its own and automatically. These physical and physiological sensations and impulses. So for instance, if you've experienced or been in a situation of threat, likely your body tenses up, right? that is how the body gears for action. Tension is a precursor of action, right? So then when the body tenses up, that happens automatically. Like I don't tell the body, tense up now, right? Or it's time to turn on the switch, right? If there's an assessment of threat, right, which again also bypasses that cognition, there's an automaticity to that physical sensation and physiological response. Yeah, so that's what this is talking about. So when that happens in an overwhelming situation, that's when we see the signs of trauma. It's important to note, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of the sources of stress and trauma. In sensory motor, we separate stress and trauma. Stress doesn't necessarily have to elevate to trauma. Many of us have experienced a lot of stress, or may be experiencing a lot of stress that doesn't elevate to trauma, to that overwhelming experience that I mentioned a moment ago. These are some of the sources, right? Like accidents, disasters, the pandemic was a big source of trauma that I don't know about you, but myself personally, I'm still unpacking the impact of the pandemic. This vicarious trauma, this terrorism, this social media trauma, right? When things, people post things about us that, or disclose things about us that we didn't want people to disclose. Medical, surgical trauma, loss, death. Again, these are just some situations, right? I don't know if it's in here also, but there is racial trauma as well. There is religious trauma written here, but there is racial trauma also. So the reason why we put it here is because there's so many different sources, and I also like to say that given the current political situation that we live around the world in so many countries, and with social media, that it's not just hearing or reading about something, we're witnessing it in real time, and that has an impact on all of us. So invariably, many of us, certainly my clients, myself, are experiencing a more elevated at stress that at times also responds to trauma. And so let me go here. I want to spend a minute talking about social locations. In sensory motor, one of our priorities in recent years has been really looking at the importance and the centrality of social locations in the treatment of trauma, which has been something missing from the literature and also from the research. And these are some of the social locations. You may be familiar also with this language in which we hold positions of privilege, positions of power, but also positions of minority, subjugation. And so the way that we think of trauma is that it interfaces with our social locations. We cannot separate our social locations from the experience of trauma, because the more a person inhabits social locations of disadvantage, of subjugation, the likelihood that they are going to experience more trauma. So, for instance, if you're working with a trans woman, black woman that does, sex work as a living, the chances of traumatic experiences for that individual would be higher. So, whereas in other methods, or how trauma is usually located within the intrapsychic, we also want our students to pay attention to the intra psychic stuff as well, right? How are we interacting with these social locations, and how these social locations, how the world interacts with us through them as well. So then the next slide here is a little bit about the brain, right? So much of trauma therapy is informed by neurobiology, which has everything to do about the nervous system and brain functioning. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it's to bring in the language of how survival responses are bottom-up responses, meaning that there is an entire physiology that is happening, as I said earlier, beyond our cognition, that is just wired in all of us. So then when there's a threat, the amygdala, which is the fire alarm of our nervous systems, right, initiates, a sympathetic nervous system response, right, with a tremendous amount of sensory information that is mediated by the thalamus. There's a lot of, different neurochemicals that are quickly released into the body. So I'm not going to go into all that because I don't want to bore you and because I'm not in neuroscience. But what is important to note from the slide is that what we now know from neurobiology is that when these bottom-up responses are triggered, the survival responses, our frontal lobe shuts down or decreases in activity. And the reason for that is to ensure an instinctual response, right? That instincts take over. So one example that I like to use is that you have read probably those about people that, like in the face of an accident, they lifted a car, right? Normally they don't have that strength, but they were able to do that, right? And they didn't even know how they did it, right? Or that they were able to push something that typically their usual strength wouldn't have allowed for, right? And that is how our frontal lobes are shut down, right? Or when somebody in a state of rage, engages in action that they wouldn't engage in, is because they're not thinking, right? They're just using that instinctual responding to the situation. So that's what we call a bottom-up response due to survival. We remember trauma with our bodies through a sensorimotor reactivation of nonverbal implicit memories of traumatic events in the form of dysregulated arousal, emotions, defensive responses, and through actually very mysterious physical symptoms with no organic basis. If you work with traumatized people, very often, what they come in is with symptoms, some of which have no medical basis, therefore are somewhat mysterious, and that they cannot quite explain. They just kind of happen without their conscious control. Is a reactivation of implicit memories that are being activated, right? That's the reactivation in this kind of dysregulated arousal. So, for instance, like I have some clients that they experience a tremendous amount of trauma growing up, and so incidents happen today, and their reaction is very disproportionate to the event, right? Because that's that reactivation of that nonverbal implicit memory. It's how the past becomes the future, becomes the present. And so when we remember trauma in our bodies, verbal recall may be inaccessible because that memory remains unintegrated and unaltered by the course of time. We're just living in the reactivation of the nonverbal implicit memory of the trauma. So trauma survivors also have a lot of sensitivity to triggers, and this is a survival response. And what happens is that long after the environmental conditions have changed, meaning long after we're out of that trauma situation, we remain in a state of readiness to perform the mental and sensory motor actions that were adaptive to that past. That's what I was saying a moment ago, that the past becomes the present and the future. Once actions become procedural, they do not require cortical involvement. They are characterized by automatic non-conscious performance of action that is efficient and automatic rather than reflective. Procedural actions are very efficient, and procedural actions or procedural tendencies is habitual responses that we all have, right? So in certain situations, like one example that one of our faculty members uses was that where she lives, she has to drive, and she often has to drive under this kind of low bridge, and she notices that her body kind of automatically kind of goes down a little bit every time under the bridge. That's procedural memory, right? That when there's a bridge, I kind of, go down a little bit, right? She's not thinking about it, right? It just kind of naturally happens. Similarly, if you drive a car, right? If you've been driving long enough, right? It becomes procedural memory. You're not thinking about the action, right? That I need the foot on the accelerator, that I need to turn here, that I need to do the blinker. It reflexively happens. That's what procedural memory is. And in trauma, procedural memory is a key component because it responds again to that survival bottom-up reactivation of past trauma memories that become locked in the system as readiness to perform these mental and sensory motor actions again. So then a few more things here. Procedural learning also creates expectations of the future. Yeah, as I was saying a moment ago, procedural memory is so ubiquitous, and it actually drives most of human behavior, and it makes it efficient. Our memory system for process and function, right? And it is reflected in habitual automatic responses, well-learned action pattern, movement, postures, gestures, automatic arousal patterns, emotional, cognitive tendencies, right? When we in certain situations go to I'm not good enough, right? Kind of as reflexive, right? Or when some people go into blaming, right? Very reflexively. Those are learned mental cognitive patterns, right? Or some people, they may say they may cry, right? Very easily in certain situations, right? Or as they say in ADP, if you're familiar with ADP, right? Feeling but not dealing, right? People that emote a lot, but nothing really changes in your practice, right? Because those tears, that cry, that emotionality is more in the land of procedural memory. Yeah, it's not a primary emotion that is ready for processing, for working through. And so one of the pieces of procedural memory is that it also becomes locked in our physical habits. Yeah, when self-continuity is strengthened, the mind and the body adapt beyond the moment by turning the future into a version of the past, right? So how does this work, right? So, one of my physical tendencies, right, that is in certain situations, I tend to very quickly pull back. Yeah. I was working with a client recently in certain situation, and she did just that. She just went, yeah, it's like, when these things happen, I just kind of immediately kind of go like this, right? So we started working with that physical pattern, with that habitual response of pulling in. In sensorimotor, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. We're much more interested in how the body holds the story. Yeah, we're more interested in the storyteller and the experience of the storyteller than the story itself. And that's not to say that the story is not important, but in sensory motor, what we can teach you is how to study the somatic pattern, and that becomes the avenue to getting to what's really happening here. So we also invite our students and sensory motor practitioners to challenge a historical approaches. History does not happen in isolation. History does matter. The past does affect the present, and the privileged cannot understand the subjugated out of context. Yeah, and I would say also vice versa. I know Ken Hardy personally, he would endorse that as well. That, we need to understand our clients' presentations in context. As I was saying, it's not just an intrapsychic process, but it's also whatever is happening intrapsychically, there is an interaction that's happening with the environment in the present and the environment in the past. So dimensions of those social locations, such as race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, language, are a key to understanding and working through a client's presenting problem. The implicit and the explicit exchange in psychotherapy does not exist in isolation, but they're fully interconnected with the journeys of the privilege and the oppression that both the therapist and the client, both the therapist and client, have respectively traveled as individuals and historically situated human beings. In other words, there used to be what I consider an antiquated idea that, we when we enter the therapy room, we leave who we are as therapists outside the room. And now that we understand more these dimensions of history and social locations and the importance of privilege, trauma, and our experience there within, who I am in the room is heavily informed by my social locations, by my own experience, and I don't get to leave those at the door, but in fact, they're right there with me in the consulting room. And same with our clients. So then the invitation from a sensory motor perspective is that as we're working with our clients, we also have a sensitivity to how those histories, how those stories of who we are around our own histories, our client's history, are playing out in the room at any given moment. Okay, implications of neuroscience challenge procedural learning. And this is also very important and key to sensory motor, that talking about trauma can reactivate the implicit memories that are locked in the person's nervous system without resolution, and thereby causing dysregulated arousal and instinctive defenses. Yeah, I have had many clients over the years that have come to me because they've been in other forms of therapy, usually but not always talk therapy, where they were invited to talk about their trauma, and they were more dysregulated and in some occasions re-traumatized from retelling that story. Why? Because those implicit memories were reactivated and there wasn't any resolution to that. So in sensory motor, what we teach therapists is that instead of talking about, the therapist can learn to work with the physical action and the body sensation rather than only the story. We teach our therapists to work with the implicit memory rather than only the explicit memory. and the neuroregulatory interventions that stabilize arousal rather than only with interpretations and social emotional interventions. So let me tell you a personal story here, which is in fact the reason why I decided to become a trauma therapist. Many years ago, I took the EMDR training, and this was prior to my learning about sensory motor. And I vividly recall that during my learning of EMDR, and I also practice quite a bit of EMDR, I am certified in EMDR as well. So during that training, we did one of the practices. If you've taken EMDR, you know that there are practices as part of the training. And I remember doing what we call a flow back, which is a type of regression, and it can sort of spontaneously happen. And I kept kind of going back and going back, not associated to any particular memory, any narrative or any declarative memory of any incident, but a very physiological response that my mother didn't love me. And those were the actual words that came up with it. Again, nothing that I could attach it to a memory, but a sensorial knowing that I wasn't loved by my mother. Now, if you meet my mother, she is the most loving person you would ever meet. So there was a little bit of dissonance between the mother that I know, and this experience that I was having that felt so real. And frankly, I don't remember how we processed it. Maybe we didn't do much because the person, helping me was also a student. But we did something with it that I don't even remember. But here's what was significant is that sometime later, and my mother and I have a very close relationship, I went to mom and I said, Mom, this happened to me. And it was kind of odd. And I just wanted to tell you about it. And she said, honey, it's true. I am the youngest of three, and my father was a heavy alcoholic at that moment. And the last thing my mother wanted was to have a third child. And so when she became pregnant, her first reaction was, I don't want this. But she was a Christian, a faith believer. Abortion was not an option, right? So she proceeded with having me, and here I am. But what was very significant to me is that somehow in my mother's womb, I felt that. It was something that I experienced and that stayed with me, and that it came forward during that EMDR practice. That is what implicit memory allows you to do. Similarly, in all trauma processing modalities, there are different protocols, but they're all geared towards targeting implicit memory. Yeah, the EMDR protocol, if you know EMDR, is targeted towards activating the memory networks, and most certainly into looking at implicit memory. So that's why we place a great importance front and center to implicit memory, physical action and body sensations, and these neuroregulatory interventions. So, sensorimotor psychotherapy and trauma treatment, right? So, while telling the story really gives us very useful information about the client's past and also the current experience, sensorimotor treatment addresses the here and now experience of the traumatic past. In other words, if you look at the definition of PTSD, right? PTSD, CPTSD, right? It's not the car accident that happened there and then. It's how that car accident is being re-experienced in the here now, right? Or if you know the whole idea or understanding, study of PTSD started with trauma, with traumatized veterans after coming from war and realizing that they were having these very intense physiological and emotional responses completely unrelated to hearing a siren, while walking down the street. That's how implicit memory works, right? So the way that we work in sensory motor is not with the narrative, it's with the implicit memory that's happening in the here now around this past experience. Again, the storyteller in the here now, how that trauma lives right now in the body. Thus, in the moment, trauma related emotional reactions, thoughts, images, body sensations, and movements that emerge spontaneously in the therapy hour is the focus of the exploration and actually the agent for change. These reactions that are happening in the here and now, the thoughts, the images, the sensations, the micro and the micro movement, we become very curious and very interested about them. Yeah, and they may seem subtle and actually to the client at times imperceptible. And in sensory motor, we teach our students to track for that. And I think there's another slide that talks about that, to track and to actually make contact, to make those micro movements or impulses go from implicit to explicit. And so that then they become available for exploration, for study, and hopefully also for change. So this is a little bit now about the window of tolerance. Perhaps you're familiar with the window of tolerance by now. It is, kind of widely understood as a very important framework, and is certainly a key concept in trauma therapy. So I'm not going to go into a big discussion on the window of tolerance. I'm going to kind of assume that you have some familiarity with this concept, but the way that I want to frame it now is in a bottom-up hijacking. And what is a bottom-up hijacking? It's when higher nervous system arrangements inhibit or control the lower, and thus when higher are suddenly rendered functionless, the lower rise in activity. Let me translate that to you, because that is a little bit of a convoluted sentence there, right? If you recall that earlier slide, how the prefrontal cortex, right, the part of the brain that has to do with narrative, with understanding, with logical thinking, right? When that part shuts down because of trauma, right, the lower or the bottom up, right, these implicit emotional sensory motor responses become much more dominant, right? And that's what we call a bottom up hijacking. So let me give you an example. I have a client that since the pandemic and through today is terrified, and I really mean it, terror about contracting coronavirus, right? So this person, because of some lived experiences from their past, right, are actually quite isolated at the moment and have been since the pandemic because they're afraid to go out. And when they go out, they take a tremendous amount of precautions in order to stay safe. And that's not to say that I'm not endorsing a certain degree of safety, but for this particular client, and they have learned to understand how disproportionate they are to the present moment conditions, right? And again, I don't want to dismiss, at least here in the US, coronavirus is on the rise. We should all take more precautions, test regularly, right? Like all of those things I endorse. But my hope, or a more kind of regulated arousal around the pandemic, would mean that you take the precautions necessary and that you're generally okay about it. For this particular client, certain activities, certain situations elevate to this dysregulated arousal. So that's what a bottom-up hijacking means. Or for the veteran, right, when they hear a siren, right, they immediately go into a state of panic. That's a bottom-up hijacking, right? And so let me just bring my cursor here, right? So this is what regulated arousal means, right? This is that optimal zone of arousal. This section right in the middle is what we call the window of tolerance, right? This section right here, right? Now, this regulated arousal, or when our capacity to be with whatever the stimuli is exceeds our capacity for integration, right? Then we go into a state of hyperarousal, right? And conversely, right, when there's insufficient activation to integrate, we go into a state of hypoarousal, right? And so in sensory motor, the reason why we're putting this here is because we teach our, our students to track for somatic signs of hyperarousal and hypoarousal. All trauma processing happens at the edge of the window, at the upper edge or at the lower edge. So you need the person to be in a state of regulation for there to be integration. Yeah. One definition of trauma, right, is too much, too fast, too soon. So we don't want to replicate that in the consulting room. How do we replicate that? When we invite clients to go to a story, right, to retell the story, and their integration capacity is exceeded and they go into a state of hyperarousal and nothing happens with that state and they leave the consulting room, they can become re-traumatized. Yeah. So we always work within the window and right on this edge, perhaps a little bit above, but right on this edge and this edge. So this is a side-by-side comparison of what a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach mean in psychotherapy. Sensorimotor psychotherapy is a bottom-up approach. Other approaches are more top-down. So what is a top-down approach? It's what what we typically consider as talk therapy, right? So it addresses cognition and emotional processing, which facilitates the functioning of lower level processing, right? So it uses cognition to regulate affect and sensory motor experience, right? So we get very, very curious about cognition in those approaches, right? The entry point is the story, right? It identifies and works with changes in cognitive distortions, right? It fosters linguistic sense of self, focuses on understanding, on meaning making, the formulation of a coherent narrative, right? On the other hand, the bottom-up approach addresses the sensory motor or body processing, which in turn facilitates the functioning of the upper levels of processing. So we privilege the sensory motor, right, information or what's happening with the body, and in turn, and with processing, that facilitates the more cognitive narrative understanding. We use the body to regulate affect and sensory motor experiences. As I said at the beginning, the entry point is the body. It identifies and changes physical and somatic patterns, fostering a somatic sense of self and focusing also on physical habits and the meaning of the affect. And it integrates levels of information processing. Yeah, not just the narrative, but also how your body holds the story, the meaning of that particular affect together with the cognition. So from this standpoint, I personally, and obviously I am biased, but I find sensory motor a much more comprehensive way of working. You've seen this before, face-oriented treatment, right? Based on Pierre Janet and also Judy Herman spoke about it. Judy Herman, in her seminal piece of work, oh my God, the body. Oh my God, I am blanking on the name of that very important piece of work. But here are the phases of treatment, right? And this is really the gold standard in treatment. Some trauma processing models don't endorse it, but most trauma processing models, at least the ones that I am familiar with, fully endorse it, right? So phase one is symptom reduction and stabilization, uh, otherwise called resourcing, right? We help clients reduce symptomatology and feel more stable, particularly clients that come in with a tremendous amount of dysregulation. Once there's enough symptom reduction and stabilization in the nervous system, that's when we move to the treatment of trauma memory. Incidentally, though we are presenting it to you in this kind of sequential, basic way, it's not so linear in real practice, right? So we may do some symptom reduction stabilization and then some trauma processing where we bring in some resourcing and we go weave in then more trauma memories, and then there's more personality integration, but something happens that necessitates more resourcing again and more trauma processing, right? So I just want to give you a flavor for the flow of an actual session. However, for learning purposes, it's helpful to separate it, right? Symptom reduction, trauma treatment of traumatic memory, and then there's personality integration where we begin to work with limiting beliefs and meaning, social reconnection and re-engaging relationships, intimacy, life issues, risk-taking, change in kind of the larger scope of life. So this is key to sensory motor, and so the way that this is applicable is that when I meet with a client, I'm always sort of checking in what phase are we in, right? Or given a recent incident, right? Like let's say the pandemic, right? With a lot of clients that I was doing more, trauma processing. The pandemic happened, and we needed to do more, sort of symptom reduction because they were having quite a bit of dysregulation given the uncertainty of what was happening, right? So let's see what else is here. I'm trying to be mindful of time as well. So this is the modulation model. It is sort of looking more specifically at the application of the window of tolerance. What the modulation looks at is arousal, yeah? And this has much to do with some animal defense responses of fight, flight, freeze, and feign death. And if you're familiar with this, there is some what is it? Some acronyms here that I want to define for you if you're not familiar with them. SNS is sympathetic nervous system, which speaks about hyperaroused zone or danger zone, right? And this has to do with freeze, cry for help, fight, flight responses. Then the social engagements or safety is the ventral vagal complex. That's what VVC, and this is all again the neurobiology underneath it. When we are in the window of tolerance, and by the way, this term was coined by Dan Siegel, and now other authors use different names like the zone of arousal or the optimal zone of arousal, or the window of resiliency is another term. So there's a variety of terms, but the original term was the window of tolerance, and Dan Siegel was the one that coined it, right? So when we are in the window, our social engagement, or we feel safe. Social engagement has to do with I see you, you see me, I feel you, you feel me, right? That's when we are in social engagement. We're in sync. Yeah, we are in this together, right? In sensory motor, we always want the social engagement system to be online. One of the telltale signs of hypoarousal is that the social engagement system begins to break down. And then there is DVC, dorsal vagal complex, or dorsal vagal collapse, right? And that is hypoarousal zone when life is a threat, right? At that point, we tend to feign death. There is a flat affect, decreased sensation, little facial expression, unresponsiveness. If you've seen people coming out of terrorist zones or war, there is that vacancy in their eyes that is very much associated with feigned death. Yeah. In hyperarousal, the opposite is true. Our eyes are hyper focused, right? There is a hyper focusing on what's around us. There's a scanning for danger, right? There is a muscle tension, right? That is happening even with this freeze. Within some authors call it a high free because there's immobility, but there is high alert inside. There's a lot of internal activity, but I'm paralyzed with the terror. This is what in some people call, the deer in the headlights. The deer knows that the truck is coming, right? But it's immobilized, right? And the cry for help is that hidden eyes, right? That are trying to make contact, seek proximity through the eyes. So then it's just to give you a sense, these are things that you learn how to work with in sensory motor, how to work with arousal. It's using the window of tolerance and taking it a little bit of step of a little bit further. And this also has to do with the polyvagal ladder, right? A polyvagal theory. And so in sensory motor, you will learn how to work with these responses, how to evaluate them, how to assess them, how to make them explicit, and how to work with them in helping people who are beginning to feel dysregulated or walking in this dysregulated into coming more into social engagement, or the opposite, right? If they're in that hypoarousal, right, to bring them back into social engagement. So then let me give you a little example here, which I think would be helpful. Some time ago, I saw a female identified client came in for an intake. It was the first session we had. And as she sat down, she proceeded to tell me one of the most horrendous trauma histories that I had heard. She came in for trauma treatment. And as she was telling me, I could tell that she wasn't quite there. This was something very flat about her voice, the immobility in her body. She was just kind of regurgitating a story. And I could tell from just noticing her body, her posture, that she wasn't quite there. That is what we call tracking in sensory motor. Rather than proceeding with the intake and the typical questions that we ask in a psychosocial assessment, right, or in a first session, I interrupted her. I put aside my questions and I said to her, let me come in for 1 second. Yeah? And I said, how are you right now? And she said, I'm fine. Yeah? And to me, that was in dissonance with what I was observing in her. And then I proceeded to ask her an important question that I now often ask. And I said, how much of you is here right now? To which she answered, I'm not here at all. Yeah. And so what was significant at that moment, right? Because that immediately suggested to me dissociation, right? Or that this piece right here, this dorsal vagal collapse, right? That she was there, but she wasn't really there. There was this vacancy in her, right? That sort of collapsed posture, she was there, just kind of regurgitating that. So then, from a true sensory motor perspective, rather than proceeding with the agenda that I had for that assessment, I actually engaged in some resourcing to bring her back online into social engagement, back into the window. And it did a series of things that I cannot go into right now. But here's what was important is that she jump started. She felt more present. She felt more related to me in the moment. And at the end of the session, I asked her, how was this for you? Because we didn't get to you telling me, what you wanted to share with me, or for me to ask you the kinds of things that I typically ask. And she said to me, this is the first time that I have felt better in a very long time. And the first time that I've had a session like this with a therapist. And to me, it was a mixture of sadness, but also I was happy for her and for the piece of work that we did at that moment. Because I didn't do what is done in traditional therapy. I used what I knew at that point about sensory motor, of privileging this window of tolerance, of bringing the person and keeping it in that social engagement. And so just wanted to give you that example to try to make sense of this modulation model. I paid attention to the hypoarousal and privileged bringing her back online using this modulation model. So in our trainings, we will teach you skills to regulate arousal within the window of tolerance, right? To notice the triggering events that are happening in the client's life and that are happening in the moment. Then we move towards regulating the dysregulated arousal, right? So moving from hyperarousal into the window, right? And from hyperarousal back into the window. Yeah, and there are many skills to do so. And this is actually some of my favorite work in sensory motor. And so these are some of the interventions that we utilize. Mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is a very, very important a skill that we utilize in our method. Differentiating body responses from thoughts and from feeling. I find that most clients don't make a distinction between those, yeah, because in our society we're not taught how to do that, right? And so we teach you ways to do that, yeah. We track patterns of movements, of gesture. We do somatic resourcing, right? Using the body as that entry point for grounding, for centering, for alignment with posture, with boundaries. And then also we help clients in facilitating resolution of undischarged arousal. So what does that mean? And I hope I'm not jumping ahead, right? If we look at animals in the wild, and there are videos of this, like the zebra, that is gazing in the African savannah, and suddenly a tiger jumps at that zebra, right? The first thing that they'll do, right, is try to fight or flight, right? And they then will, if that fails, then they will fall into that hypoaroused also vagal collapse, right? And if they're able to escape, very often what happens, so if the tiger, leaves them for whatever reason, right, they'll begin shaking, yeah? And that trembling, that shaking that naturally happens is what we call the discharge of that arousal. Guess what? Human beings go through the same. But because of our social learning, what we tend to do is the opposite. We tend to inhibit that natural discharge that happens in the body. Some years ago, I had to have some minor surgery back here on my neck for a little cyst that I had. It was nothing big, but it was under local anesthesia and it felt very uncomfortable. And I vividly recall that when I got home, I was shaking for hours. Yeah. But what was helpful is that I knew sensory motor by then, and I was a practitioner, so I allowed that discharge to happen, that shaking to naturally happen, and I felt better. Not that if I had inhibited necessarily, I would have felt worse necessarily, but in sensory motor we learn that trauma very often has to do with that undischarged arousal that gets locked in the nervous system, and we help in the facilitating of the resolution of this of that discharge. So here is a peace protocol that the faculty of sensory motor with Pat created. And this is a helpful, very helpful 5 steps of modulating activation and building resilience. And we are going to drop a handout of this on the chat so you can have it available to you. And please feel free to use it. It's actually quite user friendly, and I teach it to my clients as a skill that they can also take with them. Yeah. So it starts with pause, right? So when we sense some dysregulation in our bodies, be it in the more hyperaroused way or in the hyperaroused way, one of the first things that we can do is to pause. Pause what we're doing to briefly identify the body signals of dysregulation, of unrest. Then the next thing that we can do is embody a somatic resource that feels supportive in the body in the moment. And to the right, there is a list of what some of those can be. So those somatic resources, right? I can't, because of time, I cannot go through every single one of them, but I'll just name a few, right? So orienting is really looking around, right? When we are in a trauma state, we are hyper vigilant and we become hyper focused and lose sight of other things. So one very useful skill is just to open our eyes just a little bit wider and to orient, to look around to the things that are in the present moment. We can make it very specific. This book is red, this table is black, the floor is brown, the wall is white, right? I'm connecting to the different objects that are around me and I'm naming them, and I'm also adding colors, I'm adding names in identifying these things. That's what orienting does, right? We can place a hand on the heart, right, and bring in a little bit of nourishing there, right? Or it can also be the belly, or it can also be a little hug, right? We can push the hands together, right? Against each other or against the wall or against an object. In so doing, I am engaging the muscles of my upper body, right? And if I'm more in touch with my body, the chances are that I'm less in the trauma or the activation. Another way to do that is just to very gently tap the body. Yeah, to tap the body or just rub it all over, all the way up to the chest, to the head, all the way down to the feet, right? I tend to feel more embodied when I touch myself in this way. Once you have done this, and again, there are many other possible somatic resources, right? Then just notice what it's like. What are the effects after you engage with that resource, right? We can acknowledge that, right? Then follow with concentrating your attention on those positive effects of the resource for at least 15 seconds, right? The suggestion of 15 to actually 30 seconds come from another body of research about creating new neural structures. Yeah, for these resources to become more portable, more embodied, more part of our nervous system, right? And then the last element in this protocol is to engage with your environment, right? Yeah, is to notice the pleasant sights, the sounds, the smells, right? The things that are around you. And I always like to ask to add, engage in something else, in some distraction. Yeah. So this is a little bit of a protocol that we also want to give to you that you can use for yourselves. And if you wanted to try it with your clients, it can actually be invaluable. Yeah. So new actions like words can be viewed as threatening and adversarial to other parts of self states whose reality is challenged by such actions. So this quote is orienting us to parts. In sensorimotor, we also use parts language, not from an internal family systems perspective, if you're familiar with that method, but from a structural dissociation and ego psychology models that also utilize parts language. And so then what this is suggesting to us is that the sensory motor practitioner is also curious about how different parts of the personality hold different pieces of what is happening to them in the present and the trauma of the past. Yeah, we become very curious about that. And so, for instance, how that works in practice, right? So, one time I was working with somebody, that went into like a dorsal vagal collapse, right? And my first impulse was to actually resource them, right, with alignment, right? Because they went into like this collapse, and the first impulse. But before going into that impulse, I check in with their system, right? Does this feel possible? And the person said, I'm not sure, I'm kind of afraid to do that. So then I said, oh, so there's a part of you that may have some fear in engaging with that. Let's get to know that fear. Now, what's the concern of that part of you? Once we had addressed that concern and that part softened, then we were able to engage with that resource, and the person momentarily felt better. Another concept in sensory motor is mindfulness, and the way that we use mindfulness, or one of the ways, is embedded relational mindfulness. We'd like to add that mindfulness has its roots in Eastern practices, and it is a concept that has been appropriated in the West for millennia. Other traditions in the East have been using mindfulness as a tool for enlightenment, for self-awareness, for self-development, self-exploration. And we like in sensorimotor to be grateful to those Eastern practices for gifting us this tool that we utilize, and that is so wonderful for us and for the treatment and processing of trauma. So in embedded relational mindfulness, we prioritize the mindful awareness of the present moment experience instead of talking about it. And I said some of that earlier, right? Because if I'm just talking about it, it's a narrative. But in sensory motor, we may ask, so as you're saying that, what are you noticing now? What's happening in your body in the moment? Or I may say, if I'm noticing, let's say, that collapse or that pulling back, wow, I am noticing as you're saying that there's like a pullback that happened. Or that your hand kind of came up almost as a boundary, right? So I'm making contact, right, with what I'm tracking based on this narrative. In sensory motor, there's an emphasis on discovering and studying the organization of the experience related to trauma and developmental injuries, and very specifically through these 5 building blocks of present moment experience. And they are thoughts and belief, which is, cognition. And then there's affect, emotion, and then there is what we call the sensory motor information processing, which include movement, five sense perception, and also sensation. Yeah. So in sensory motor, we teach you how to discover, how to explore, how to study the organization of the experience of these 5 building blocks. And then we work towards changing procedural learning, right? So we now notice the body's chronic patterns and repetitive responses. We engage with them mindfully to help the client become more curious about this pattern. We don't move quickly to interpretation in sensory motor, but rather in studying the organization of that experience. And then once we engage with that pattern mindfully, we move to challenging that learned pattern by using non-verbal techniques that engage alternative physical action that are not going to cause a flooding, as in a hypoarousal, right? Or as in dissociation in hypoarousal, right? With that client, with the intake that I just talked about, that's actually precisely what I did. I challenged the procedural pattern because she had been in many other therapies before of coming in and just regurgitating the story and collapsing and dissociating along the way. So I challenged that pattern, right? I noticed it, I engaged with it mindfully, I challenged it, and what we actually did was engage in a lot of somatic resourcing, some of which were in that peace protocol that I just shared with you. And then that brought her into the window. We didn't get at that session to continue doing more work, but just for her to be able to be in that window was actually quite extraordinary. Yeah. So this is how we change procedurally learned patterns. So we track the body, and we have about 5 more slides. I promise that I'll be finishing quick, okay? So we're always tracking the body, right? The therapist must learn to observe the precise, and there's a precision in sensory motor that I find quite exquisite. The therapist learns how to observe the precise detail in the moment by moment organization of the sensory motor experience, in the subtle changes that are happening in skin, as skin color changes, dilation of the nostrils or pupils, tension, trembling, goosebumps, narrowing the eyes, micro movement, macro movements, right? And the more obvious changes like collapse through the spine, the turning of the neck, the lifting of a hand, the push, etc. Right? So we become very curious. We track both of these, the subtle changes and the obvious changes, right? The more subtle implicit ones and the more obvious explicit ones. So then I want to show you now very quickly. This is like a 2-minute video of Pat doing a short resourcing session with one particular client. And this is just but a portion of the session. Let me just find the video here. Let me actually, I should have had it queued. Okay, so let me put it here. And I'm gonna go. Let me just cue it back. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, so let me come back to you. And what I'm going to do now is share my other screen. Oh, give me 1 second here. Okay. Okay, can you see it? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so let me play it for you. Let me just start it. Yeah. Oh, is it? Okay.
We're not seeing any video yet.
Sorry, I muted myself. Were you able to watch the video or no? Oh, sorry about that. I was playing it. I thought you were seeing it. Okay, so I am so sorry about that. I thank you for letting me know. Uh, so Sebastian, can you help me here?
Yes,
Because I thought I was sharing the video. Yeah.
I think we saw the first frame, but it wasn't moving.
Oh, it wasn't moving. Okay, so let me try it again. Hold on. Let me. Sorry about that, you all. Let me see if I can do it again here. Okay, are you able to see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see. Let me play it from the beginning because, okay, and then if someone can help me if you can hear it, yeah? Okay, can you hear it now?
No, can't hear it.
Okay, so Sebastian, can you help me with this part? I'm not sure how to make the sound accessible.
Sure. Stop sharing screen.
Okay, stop sharing screen.
When you press share screen again,
Uh-huh.
on the right side, there's an options. There should be a check mark that says share sound.
Okay, I don't have it.
Is that, are you looking at what windows to share your screen?
Yes, oh, here. Okay, there we go. Okay, now I got it. Okay, sorry you all. Thank you for bearing with me about the video piece. Okay, hold on. Okay, can you see it again? See the video?
Yes.
Okay, and tell me about the sound now. Is the sound coming through now?
No. Can you play it again?
Okay,
No. No
no.
sound.
No sound. Okay, so let's try this again. Sorry you all. Let me see if I can. Okay, so here's the video. Oh, hold on, I didn't press the other button. Hold on, okay. Okay, I'm trying. Here we go. Okay, let's see now.
So, Katie, you had a trauma memory to address?
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Yay, we got it. Okay, so let me play from the beginning so that you all can see it now.
So, Katie, you had a trauma memory to address?
Yeah.
You want to say just a little bit about it, and also let's track your body
Okay.
as you start to think about it.
Okay. Yeah. It was when I was 10. With my grandfather.
And something changes now just as you start to think about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. It's like, I just start to kind of get
A little fuzzy.
a little fuzzy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's pause for a moment and just check in with your body. And I mean, I'd like to hear the story if you want to tell me, but
Yeah.
I'd like to track your body too.
Yeah.
So what do you notice happening as we start?
Yeah. Like, like I'm holding my breath and
Something in here,
my stomach.
like your stomach's turning over, or there's a
Yeah, like
churning,
kind
there's
of nauseous maybe.
nauseous.
Yeah, a little like woozy.
A little woozy.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you feel your feet on the ground?
I had
You hadn't thought of that.
Maybe I lost them, but
Yeah.
I can feel them on the ground.
Let's just for a moment. Let's check out if you just push your feet into the ground just a little bit. See if what happens to the nauseousness and the fogginess. Just
That helps.
It
yeah,
helps.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think I
on
starts
your
to feel
hand.
more solid.
Oh,
Yeah.
and your hand wants to come
Oh,
there
yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So see if that feels right to have your hand there and push your feet a little bit and just feel a little more solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not kind of. Yeah, that helps not to be so woozy.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So you feel that shift in your body.
Yeah.
Ah, there's a nice breath.
Yeah.
Too. Okay, great.
Yeah. It's amazing how it just starts to come up, even just starting to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a little bit of a mini demonstration of one of the skills in sensorimotor. This is that somatic resourcing that I was talking about earlier. You saw how the client started telling the story, right? And immediately there was a lot of activation coming up. And Pat very quickly moved to interrupt the narrative and place attention in the somatic response that was happening. They studied it a little bit, and Pat introduced a grounding exercise, which incidentally is one that you can do with your clients and with yourselves at any moment, of feeling the feet on the ground and pressing very lightly. And you could tell how the client's affect and experience in the moment began to feel differently, right? So this is something that we would do and that I do a lot in my sessions, right? That as we begin to address something with activation, right? I'm tracking the body as Pat was doing, and depending on what's coming up, right? Is a person in the window or not, I'll move very quickly to interrupt the narrative, to bring in some more resources to not lose the person out of the window. Yeah. So then let me share with you just a couple of more slides and another short video, and then I'll take questions. Yeah. I know that I have been talking for a long time now, so I want to be sure that you're still with me, that I haven't lost you. So here, right, so preparatory movements are actions that wanted to happen, right? So and this is the things that we're tracking for in sensorimotor, right? So in fight, there's typically some movements, for protection, right? There's tension being, as I said earlier, precursor for action. Tension or sensation in the jaw, the shoulders, the arm, usually is more related to the extremities in a fight response. And in a flight response, right? If you know anything about neurobiology, the blood actually moves to our extremities because we need our legs, our feet, our hands, our arm to fight and to flight, right? In flight, we also have the movement, we have tension, the pelvis, the leg, the feet, leaning backwards, moving away. It can be a type of flight response and wanting to run. And then that cry for help, also that movement, right, it is there usually with the eyes. There's also tension, the throat, feeling a sound rising, an impulse to yell, right? So these are all things that we are tracking. We're tracking these we call preparatory movements that didn't get to happen at the moment of the trauma, and we want to bring them forward, make them explicit, and we also want to work with them. So therapeutic bottom-up processing, right? Instead of talking about the experience, what we do in sensorimotor is that we help clients learn to observe and describe their experience in simple words. Essentially, that's what mindfulness is. It's the capacity to observe, right, this internal present moment experience. We teach clients to notice the habitual movements, the postures, the inner body sensations as they are unfolding in the here now. Again, not in the there then. Instead of interpreting the experience, kind of trying to find associations, interpretation, those more cognitive processes, we help clients to be curious about what they notice and about the experience, again, in this present moment. Yeah? So I think I'm gonna, so this is that second video that I want to show you. And this is a little bit of how we do processing, right? How we utilize the somatic responses and how we work with them and help them to completion, yeah? So I'm gonna stop the share so that then I can share the next video. Give me just 1 second here so that I can cue it, and then I will be able to show it. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my slide, zoom, share screen, this one. Okay, you should be able to hear it this time.
So the next thing that happened, he'd asked me to come over and
The video stopped, Raymond.
Raymond, the video window disappeared.
Sorry about that, you all. That was my fault. I accidentally hit the wrong button. When it was coming up, were you able to hear it and see it or no?
Yes,
Yes.
the is
Yeah?
working.
Okay, great. So let me continue then. Yeah. I will start it again.
So the next thing that happened, he'd asked me to come over and so I did, and he motioned for me to sit down on the edge of the bed.
Mm-hmm.
So I sat down and he was there.
Uh-huh.
And then
Yeah.
it just didn't, it wasn't right. First of all, he also didn't have his shirt on, so that was also a good part of what felt wrong.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and
What?
I'm just noticing as I'm.
I see that too. You're tensing up again.
And I'm not breathing.
And you're not breathing. Should we stay with your body for a few minutes, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just stay with that, Katie. You're tensing up and you're not breathing, and there's something in this right hand. It looks
Yeah.
like an arm.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you, tension?
Yeah.
It's different from the bracing though, it
Yeah.
looks like.
No,
Yeah.
it's different because he was reaching toward me.
Okay, all right, so right there, you can almost see that, right? See him right with that image, yeah, see him reaching and see what your body response is. Like what your body wants to do. I see a lot of tension.
Yeah.
Is it too much or?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
So stay sensitive to your body, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's like my arm is like pulling in,
Pulling in,
To my-
okay.
like side.
Okay, so feel it pulling in.
Mm-hmm.
Just sense that, and often, you know, it looks very tense. And-
Yeah, it's like all along here. It's
Yeah.
like really, really tense.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
head
yeah.
feels like really tense.
Okay. So if you sense that tension right now and kind of ask if that tension could move, would there be a movement that you know your arm would want to make? And if nothing comes, don't worry about it, but just
Yeah, I
check
feel
it
like
out.
I might want to just.
Just go out like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just move outward. Uh-huh. And what happens? Do you want something against it, or does it just feel like you want to make that motion, or
Maybe something against it. Yeah.
to push, to move against? So
Yeah.
should I hold it right
Yeah.
here? Yeah, okay, and
And just push it.
if it feels right in your body, let your body guide
Yeah.
you. See if your body wants to make that movement. You can,
It does.
you can sense that. Okay, so just sense that. Yeah, and let that movement happen as hard as and as strong as you want. And it brings up emotion,
Yeah.
but it feels good.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I want to be able to like push it away.
Okay, so go
Yeah.
ahead and push. Just push. I want to use both hands. Yeah. Just push. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. And feel your body now. Just feel your body. Drop the content with your grandfather and all. Just sense your body. There's a lot of breath and
Wow.
something changes.
Yeah,
there.
it was like a big like rush
Uh-huh.
to my body.
Like a rush of energy. Yeah.
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 I kind of want to do it again.
You want to do it again?
Yeah.
Okay, how can you feel that in your body?
I
You
don't,
wanna
it just
do it
like
again?
yeah, I just
You
can
just
tell
wanna-
like yeah. I
Okay,
wanna
should
just-
I
yeah.
push again like here?
Yeah, and let
And-
me do it. Let me
Okay.
push it away.
And am I giving you the right pressure?
Yeah, a little less maybe.
A little
yeah,
less.
yeah.
Okay. So you really want to push away. Yeah. And again, there's a little rush, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Like I feel it all the way in my stomach.
all the way in your stomach. What kind of feeling there is it?
Like relief.
Like a relief. Yeah. Stay with the aftermath of that. You just made that pushing gesture, and there's a relief in your body. Yeah. A
Yeah.
good feeling.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
felt like something that I've wanted to do for such a long time.
Yeah. You would have wanted to do it then, but of course you couldn't, but now you can, huh? Yeah, and it feels good.
Yeah, it does
Yeah.
feel good.
Yeah. What's the aftermath in your arm? And
It's like kind of tingly, but like in a different way.
kind of
Like
tingling.
energized kind of
Yeah,
feeling.
like energy.
Yeah.
And you're
And it
sitting
like
out.
goes all the way back
Yeah.
into my back actually.
Feels
Yeah.
good in your back too.
Yeah, like it's kind of like, it's like a different buzzy. It's like just kind of bubbly maybe.
Yeah, like an energy bubbly
Yeah.
feeling. Yeah, and you're sitting kind of tall right
Yeah.
now too. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt really strong to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of a flavor, right? If you notice in that video, that Pat, again, they contacted a piece of the story, of the narrative. The activation was coming up, and Pat immediately moved towards working somatically with her, right? They dropped the content of the story, right, and stayed with the sensation and what the body wanted to do that didn't get to do. And Pat supported her in completing that action, right? That is that discharge that I spoke to you all about. These are the kinds of things that we do in Sensorimotor. And again, I am biased, but it is actually quite powerful, to be able to work in a different way with clients. Now, some of you may be asking, right, but Pat is right there with her in person. Many of us are working online. There are a number of adaptations that can be done and that Sensorimotor have integrated to engage in similar activities like the one that Pat introduced with the pillow and that pushing in an online format. Yeah. So I just want to show you one more slide that actually speaks about this, and then I'll stop and I'll take your questions in the last few minutes that we have together. So it's this slide right here because this is actually what happened in that little snippet that we just showed you, right? So that there was that activation, right? And we bring attention to that dysregulated arousal and that body sensation, right? And if you notice, Pat did not focus on the emotions or the content of the memory or the thoughts. She actually instructed the client to stay with the body. And they studied, for a few moments, the felt sense of that tension in her arm, and then asked the body what the body wants to do. And that is the facilitation of the completion of that action and thereby reorganizing that response. That is the sensory motor processing. As you saw, they did it twice. You may need to do it multiple times before moving on to the next pieces of that particular memory. And what happens invariably is that the arousal returned to the window of tolerance, right? If you saw it with that little snippet, right, that the client felt the relief, right? There was a sense of strength. Her affect changed, her posture changed. She started smiling more. There was more breath in her body, right? So that is kind of that integration that happens, right? So just to give you a flavor of what the typical kind of sensory motor trauma processing session moves in different contexts, in different presentations as well. So with that, I am going to stop. There were a couple of other slides, but some of it was just kind of redundant material. So in the last probably like 12 minutes that we have together, I'd like to take questions. I see a hand. Isabel, did I get that right, Isabel?
You got that right, Isabel.
Bienvenida.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Okay, so gracias. That last slide about the uncoupling said that you uncouple the sensations from the emotion.
Yes.
So what I saw in the video, and I'm not trained in this way, but I work very much in that way, but I don't understand the concepts. I'm just doing it.
Yes.
How does the uncoupling happen from the emotion? You're physically working with their body and the sensation and the impulse of what the body wants to do. When that impulse is allowed to come through and finishes, is it because you as the therapist aren't focusing on what the client is feeling? You're not bringing them to that awareness? How does it get uncoupled?
Right. So if you heard it in the video, Pat instructed the client at a moment there to drop the content and just stay with the body. Yeah. If the client describes emotion at that moment, you instruct the client to feel that emotion as sensation.
As sensation.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right?
Okay, that makes sense.
So very often, the client at a moment like that will experience panic, right? Or a sense of terror, right? If they're, sort of in the face of remembering that traumatic moment. So you instruct them to feel that panic, feel that terror as sensation. How is your body feeling that terror right now? So you don't go into the emotion, into the exploration of the emotion, because again, we're privileging the body. Yeah. We want the body to complete the action, the discharge that didn't get to happen at the moment of the actual trauma. And there are many different ways, and that is what our training is actually about, in teaching you the subtleties of how to do that. Yeah.
And if you were to, stay there with the emotion, is that one way of staying in the story and just not getting them to the physiological aspect, the sensation?
Sorry, Isabel, for some reason my internet froze for a moment, so can you say the last part? Yeah.
So, um, in not focusing on the emotion, that is one, and focusing on the so when you stay away from the emotion, you're also like moving away from the content. Emotion in this realm is considered part of the content of this
Uh,
of the client's story.
not exactly. We bring in the content, right? A sliver of the content, like this particular client, right? They took that sliver of sensing this individual without a shirt too near them, right? Like we don't know more about that,
Yeah.
but Pat very quickly privileged what was happening in the body. Pat was tracking those sensory motor sensations that were quite obvious, and perhaps you could see them, and Pat moved very quickly to work with them. Yeah. And by the way, it's not that we never bring in emotion and the cognition or the meaning, but in sensory motor, in working it from a bottom up perspective, we privilege how the body is holding that story, and we support the body again in completing the action, in discharging whatever didn't get to happen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Any other questions about the video or what I discussed, or about the training in general? We don't have a tremendous amount of time, so if you're hesitating about asking a question, I invite you to just jump right in. Yeah.
How long is it? How long is the training? Come
Okay.
on, let's go.
Sure, you're right. So it depends. We have trainings. Most of our trainings right now are online, and it depends on the type of training you join. Some trainings meet, let's say, for 3 days, a Monday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Some trainings meet a Saturday, Sunday, or Friday, Saturday. So it depends the type of training, the amount of what we call modules that you would have. We also have some of our trainings that are what is called a flipped classroom, in which you do much of the learning on your own at your own pace at home, and then you come into the classroom only 3 times for a 2-day module, in which we simply deepen into the material that you've already learned. And then we've also begun to introduce some in-person trainings as well. But those are slowly kind of being reintroduced, because most of the demand has been about online trainings, such as yourselves, that we have people from all over the world right now. So, yeah. And we do have a level 1, a level 2, and a certification level. Yeah. Our level 1 is more working with what we consider big T trauma, right? And the skill that you saw Pat do, you learn more in our module, in our first level training. And then more relational trauma, or the sort of the more small T trauma, things like neglect. You learn more how to work with that in our level 2, and certainly complex trauma, and more heavily into delving into dissociation, which is one of the key symptomatologies of complex trauma. And then our level 3 is more towards certification and really deepening into the skills that you've already learned in our level 1 and our level 2. So, yes. Chris, please.
Yeah, look, thank you so much, Raymond. Just want to say this was just really beautiful, and I'm registering for the first Australian training of level 1 in March, and very excited that it's coming to Australia and then I'm doing it. I just wanted to share also just that my husband and I are adoptive parents of two boys who came into our lives 8 years ago from a background of complex trauma, and they were the people who introduced me to trauma and my need, my passion for supporting people in this way, which has led me to this place now. So your lived experience, I just appreciate the generosity of you sharing that, because it really resonated with me too. So yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Chris, and good luck. Yes, I know that they brought the trainings back to Australia, so delightful. Yeah, good luck. Yeah, so I see another hand. I believe the name is Show. Did I get that correctly?
So I believe you got asked this question before.
Sure.
What differences between somatic experiencing and sensorimotor psychotherapy? I know these two modalities are quite similar. Based on what I heard.
Right. Right. So I am not that familiar with somatic experiencing. That's Peter Levine's work. What I can tell you is that sensory motor and somatic experiencing have very similar roots, and in fact, Peter Levine and Pat Ogden collaborated early on in the development of their respective models. So they are somewhat different from my understanding in their approaches, but I cannot speak specifically to how they differ because I'm not very familiar with somatic experiencing. Yeah.
Okay. Got you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, about the training or about the material that I presented. I hope that some of it is already familiar to you. Some of this terminology, like the window of tolerance, has made it more into mainstream psychotherapy and psychology. But if it's not, and this was the first time that you heard about these terms and this way of working, I encourage you to take one of our trainings where we really go much more deeply into each and every one of these skills. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. I see some people sharing on the chat, but I haven't been following the chat. Yeah. Insightful. Someone saying good, good. Yeah, it's really beautiful work, y'all. I had and again, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Is it Show or Shu?
Sure.
Show, okay. So very early on in my sort of trauma career, I had a somatic experiencing supervisor who I was debating, doing sensory motor somatic experiencing and sort of how to go about learning about this, and he told me, whichever you do, just do it because it will change you. Yeah,
Right.
and to me, that was quite shocking because we all come into this for our clients, right? Like I'm learning this, to bring it to my practice, and so that he referenced me, and now after having done the training and now doing teaching, it actually made sense to me. Like I've become a better person, and to your comment, Chris, actually a better father because of it. Because I'm much more attuned to my own responses, to my own body, and sort of what's happening there. And I'm much more curious about that. And so, with that, I encourage you all to consider that the training, or if you go into somatic experiencing as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Raymond.
You're welcome. Yeah. So in the last minute that we have together, according to my clock, anything else? Any other questions or comments?
Thank you,
You're welcome.
really.
You're welcome. So it's been a pleasure being with you all. I hope that the material and the explanation and the examples carry through. And if you feel moved into taking one of our trainings, I look forward to seeing you. I'll be teaching one out of Central Time Zone starting in December, but there's a number of trainings that are starting sooner and some even later into 2025 as well. You can check our website and it has all the information. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay? So with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are at in the world. And also, may you continue learning. Okay? All the very best to you. Blessings.